Last week, we talked about every Western Conference team and graded their season through 50 games. Now, let's go through every team in the Eastern Conference by division and see where they stand before All-Star break. But before we get started, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to watch more NBA videos just like this one. So without further ado, let's start by talking about the Atlantic Division, which is home to, record-wise, the best team in all of basketball, the Boston Celtics. Now, the Celtics boast one of the best starting fives we've seen in the past 10 seasons, headlined by Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, who continue to elevate their play year after year. They're joined by newcomers Kristaps Porzingis and Drew Holiday, who bring defense and the ability to bail out Tatum or Brown if they're struggling on a specific night. But the revelation of the Celtics season is Derek White, who was in All-Star considerations for bringing great defense and 16 points a night while shooting 40% from three. Now, this team has been one of the most entertaining to watch this season, delivering multiple instant classics with the Thunder and Timberwolves over the past 8 weeks. But what to watch for with this Celtics team is health. When the starting five is fully healthy, I don't personally think there's a team in basketball that can beat them in a series. But when little injuries take down Porzingis for a week, that's when we start to see this team struggle. You would of course like to see a little more lineup consistency in that regard, but if this team can stay healthy, and that's a big if, but if they can, then I don't think they lose the NBA title. For that reason, I'm going to give the Celtics an A+, while being cautiously optimistic that they can stay healthy. Going from an extremely fun team to watch to a team that I struggle to sit down and watch, the Brooklyn Nets are currently 11th in the East with a 20-29 record. And the reason why they're one of the least fun team to watch is that as a franchise, they're stuck. The Nets don't own any of their first-round picks until 2028. So if they decide to trade one of their win-now pieces like Spencer Dinwiddie or Dorian Finney-Smith, the team will start to fall further down in the standings, and they won't get a top prospect in return for sucking. Since the start of December, the Nets have won only 10 games, 3 of which are against the Pistons and Wizards. So there's probably not much hope in Brooklyn for the Nets to turn it around, especially with the type of roster they have. It's nice to see Mikal Bridges and Nicholas Claxton start to pick up the pace after a slow start, and it's also nice to see Lonnie Walker thriving off the bench as a 47% three-point shooter. And I must admit that I've been a little more intrigued with this team ever since Ben Simmons came back from injury. But there's not much else to say about this team, and because they're stuck and not a fun team to watch, I'm going to give them a D- this season. Now let's talk about that other team in New York, the Knicks, who sit in 4th place in the East with a 32-18 record. The Knicks are thriving after the acquisition of OG Anunoby, with a bunch of double-digit wins since then, including one against the fully healthy 76ers. But the story of the Knicks revolves around Jalen Brunson, who has elevated his play as a lead guard and created open looks for their three-point shooters. And after an extremely rough start, Julius Randle is starting to turn it around, and he made a great case to be an all-star, which he is. I mentioned earlier three-point shooting, and if you disregard Randle's 29% shooting from three, the Knicks will have guys like Dante DiVincenzo who shoot 44% from three, Jalen Brunson who shoots 42% from three, OG Anunoby who shoots 39% from three with all defensive level play on the other side of the ball. They have Quentin Grimes also shooting 39% from three. They have really great solid shooters that open the floor for a player like Randle to attack inside the arc. I like this Knicks team a lot, and they're starting to go where I thought they would before the season. The cherry on top of this season would be New York acquiring a guy like Malcolm Brogdon, though I wouldn't be shocked if they tried to hold on to some draft capital and make a splash in the offseason that will ultimately fall through. This is a really solid team, one that has the potential to make a run to the conference finals. So because of that, and because of how well they've been playing recently, I'm going to give the Knicks an A. Now let's talk about the Toronto Raptors, who, since moving on from Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby, have looked really, really bad. But honestly, that's what I'm expecting from a team where Jakob Poeltl and Chris Boucher have some of the most NBA experience. So instead of focusing on the bad parts, let's talk about the somewhat good parts. Obviously, Scottie Barnes has been incredible this season, though I would like to see him get a little more consistent as a number one scoring option. And the new acquisitions, Emmanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett, have had more good games than bad, so that's nice. But I'd say the biggest takeaway from these two big trades are that the front office seems to have found its footing after some questionable trades, like giving away this year's first-round pick, top 6 protected, for Jakob Poeltl, which is what likely caused Toronto to move on from Anunoby and Siakam, because they didn't want to stay mediocre and lose that draft pick. but I like the additions of the aforementioned Quickly and Barrett, and Bruce Brown is always a nice guy to have on your roster. Other than that, it's pretty clear that Toronto wants to go through a mini rebuild, and they believe the guys they acquired can help them maybe get back into a top 10 seed within the next couple of seasons. So because the roster changes were needed and the Raptors are committed to the retooling, I'm going to give them a C- for this season. To close out the Atlantic Division is the Philadelphia 76ers, who are 30-19 and 5th in the Eastern Conference. There's a lot of small things to nitpick about the Sixers to start the season, like their strength of schedule, which is second to last in the NBA so far, and Joel Embiid already missing double-digit games and counting after we found out he tore his meniscus last week. But criticizing this team because of that would be completely disregarding how well this team is playing together. The Sixers are only one of 4 teams in the NBA to be both top 10 in offensive and defensive rating. And yes, you could attribute that to playing easier competition. But the Sixers don't just beat these teams, they dominate them. While he's now out with injury, Joel Embiid would have 35 points at the end of the third and sit the entirety of the fourth because they're winning by 30 plus points. But it wasn't just Embiid that was playing well. It was Tyrese Maxey, an all-star this season who's putting up 27 points a game. It's Tobias Harris, who's playing well as a third option. And it's their bench, consisting of guys like Nicholas Batum, Kelly Oubre, DeAnthony Melton, and Patrick Beverley, who are playing their role in contributing to winning basketball. The question now is, how will this team operate without their MVP Joel Embiid? What made this team roll through the competition was their dominance in free throw shooting, where they're both first in attempts and makes per game, and turnovers, where they average the 4th least per game and take away the 5th most. But how will they fare without Embiid in those categories? This team felt legit, and every player on the Sixers felt motivated to right their past playoff wrongs and make it past the second round. But of course you have to take into account Embiid missing at least another month, and maybe even the rest of the season. For all the reasons mentioned above, I'm going to give the Sixers a B+, but watch out for this team if or when Embiid comes back and properly recovers from his injury, as they could definitely make a run in the playoffs. Now let's move on to the Southeast Division, home of one of my least favorite teams, the Washington Wizards. This team is just bad, plain and simple. And sure, you can attribute that to the front office deciding to blow up the team about 4 years too late. But to trade Bradley Beal and Kristaps Porzingis and buy into a draft that experts are calling one of the worst of the 21st century is just idiotic. And even if you take away the draft compensation the Wizards received, which is not much by the way, the 2 primary options on this team are Kyle Kuzma and Jordan Poole. Nothing against those 2 basketball players, of course, because I think they could be valuable players on a good team in a diminished role. But no sports organization should have players like Kuzma and Poole as the guys on the front of their posters. There's a lot more bad on this team that I could go through, but let's focus on the good for a second. Bilal Coulibaly, the Wizards' 2023 first-round pick, is actually really good, especially for someone who we thought would be a project heading into the season, especially on the offensive side of the ball. And then there's guys like Daniel Gafford and Tyus Jones, who can bring a certain element to a basketball team. In Gafford's case, size and rebounding, and in Jones's case, playmaking. And maybe one or both of those guys are trade pieces who you can get a future draft pick for. And finally, there's Deni Avdija, who in my mind is having a breakout season despite only improving slightly statistically. Because in limited touches this season, Avdija is shooting the ball really well, improving from 44% from the field to 50%, and from 30% from 3 to 38%. And maybe that's because he's playing a more diminished role, but still, I'd like to see the Wizards utilize his talent more. But with that being said, the Wizards still don't have 10 wins and we're already over halfway through the regular season. So despite the 4 positives I see on this team, there's still 11 negatives. Because of that, I'm going to give the Wizards a D- this season. Next up, let's talk about the Orlando Magic, who have cooled down just a little bit after starting as one of the top 4 teams in the East, but still boast one of the best defenses in the league. The Magic allow the least amount of shot attempts per game, the 4th least amount of rebounds per game, the least amount of assists per game, and force the 2nd most turnovers per game. And like I mentioned with the Rockets in my last video, the Magic have established a culture that focuses on defense. And what I love about this Magic team is that they play at their own pace and make other teams play their game. There's a lot to like about the young core the Magic boast, like Paolo Banchero, the number 1 overall pick 2 years ago that is quickly blossoming into a star. Along with Banchero is Franz Wagner, a third-year player that while not making that step we all thought he would, is still playing great. And then you have supporting pieces like Jalen Suggs, Anthony Black, Gogo Batadze, even Jonathan Isaac, who help contribute to this team in many different ways. It's great what the Magic have built after years of mediocrity, but there's a couple of things I'd like to see improve before the trade deadline. First and foremost, this team needs shooting. And I respect the Magic for trying to fix this problem with the Jet Howard draft pick and the Joe Ingles signing. But Howard has been struggling big time as a rookie, and Ingles is too much of a defensive liability to play more than 20 minutes a night. And now all of a sudden, the Magic have more guys shooting less than 30% from 3 than guys shooting above the league average 36% from 3. It's something I'd like to see the Magic improve on before this Thursday's trade deadline. And secondly, as much as I hate to say this, I think it's time to move on from Markelle Fultz. I know, he's been great while he's been playing these past couple of weeks, but I think you can slide a guy like Anthony Black into Fultz's position, and then you can get the 19-year-old some more in-game experience and develop him into maybe something more than what Fultz is now. I like this Magic team a lot, and I think a B is fair for their season so far, but if they get the shooting and allow their younger guys to continue to develop, this is going to be a dangerous team very soon. Now let's talk about the Charlotte Hornets, who are sitting near the bottom of the Eastern Conference in a season full of some ups and a lot of downs. Let's talk about the good parts of the Hornets season first, highlighted by Brandon Miller, who has been absolutely phenomenal to start his career. About a month or two ago, I made a video talking about every NBA rookie, and in that video, I was impressed with Miller's play, but I wanted to see a little more from him. Well, in the last 6 weeks, he's been really great as a shot creator and overall great second option to LaMelo. And while close games in Charlotte are a rarity, he's come up big in those games, hitting contested threes and step-back jumpers in wins over Minnesota and San Antonio in January. Other than Miller, we've seen flashes from LaMelo and Mark Williams, who seem to be the two guys Charlotte wants to build around. But both have been injured for extended periods of time, and as a result, this team has struggled to find their footing. This team can't really shoot, doesn't rebound or play defense, and rarely plays any team close. Which brings me to the question I'm sure every Charlotte fan has asked themselves. Why is Steve Clifford the head coach of the Charlotte Hornets? Sure, he found some mild success in the mid-2010s, but the NBA has changed drastically since Clifford was fired in 2018. And I know this roster isn't the most talented, but you would probably want to look for a young and up-and-coming head coach to lead a young and up-and-coming team. Instead, Clifford will likely be fired again at the end of this season, and Charlotte will be right back where they started 2 years ago, except whoever becomes this team's new head coach is going to have to turn around the culture in Charlotte before it starts hurting their young stars. For their season, I'm going to give the Hornets a D-, and that really might be generous. Next, let's talk about the Miami Heat, who have had an up and down regular season so far. The story with this team is injuries, as their top rotational players have been in and out of the lineup, and the team has struggled with finding a groove, and as a result, they ended January with 5 straight losses by 9 or more points. We all know the Heat are going to be a team that play better once April and May come around, but how sustainable is this model when Jimmy Butler is already 34 years old? And it's not just them cruising through the regular season that scares me. It's also the fact that they've played much worse this regular season than last year or the year before that. The Heat have normally been able to rely on their stellar defense to carry them despite subpar offensive performance. But this is the first time in the Jimmy Butler era that the Heat are not a top 5 defense. And even if you take that away and say the Heat still have a top 10 defense, this is the first time in the Jimmy Butler era that per game they score less points than they allow. And that's all while having one of the 5 easiest schedules to start the season. It's easy to say the Heat are coasting through the regular season, and that they have playoff performers that rise when needed. And while I certainly wouldn't bet against the Heat in May, I would certainly not guarantee that playoff Jimmy will be present, and even if he were, I'm not sure that would be enough to get through the top of the East. We are of course just grading the Heat based on the regular season, so I'd probably give them a C so far, but I'm gonna pay close attention to the Heat in their last 5 to 10 games and see if they can kick it into high gear. To close out the Southeast Division is the Atlanta Hawks, who have had one of the most disappointing seasons in recent memory, going from a team many thought could finish as a top 6 seed to a team fighting to make the play-in. And the problem is that this team cannot play defense. It's understood that Trae Young will never be a good defender, though I will say this season he's lost the label of worst defender in the league and has upgraded to a below average defender, so good for him I guess. But take away Trae, and you have a starting lineup with DeJounte Murray, who was once a really good defender in San Antonio, DeAndre Hunter, who was selected 4th overall in 2019 because of his defensive impact, and Clint Capella, who's a pretty solid rim protector. But somehow, once Murray and Hunter got to the Hawks, they just forgot how to play defense, and Capella hasn't been as impactful on that side of the ball as you would have liked him to be. Overall, this team allows the second most points on a night-to-night basis in the NBA, and opponents shoot 50% from the field and 38% from 3, which are the 3rd worst marks in the league. There's a lot of questions surrounding the future of the Hawks, but I think we're going to see how the front office views this team come Thursday's trade deadline, and don't be surprised if Murray or any of their top guys get traded. So because of the Hawks' struggles, I'm going to give them a D+ for this season. Now let's talk about the Central Division, with the headliner here being the Milwaukee Bucks, who have somehow stayed near the top of the East despite having a lot of major flaws. Now the story here is Damian Lillard, the Bucks' big acquisition before the start of the season that was meant to help get Giannis a true second option after their embarrassing defeat at the hands of the Heat in the 2023 playoffs. In theory, it's a good idea, because while Jrue Holiday is one of the 3 best perimeter defenders in the league, he wasn't effective at all while guarding Jimmy Butler in the playoffs. And the Bucks still have former DPOY Giannis and the player who finished second in DPOY voting last season, Brook Lopez. So giving up Jrue and some future picks for Dame, who could bring a new aspect of offensive talent the Bucks haven't had with Giannis, would be great for that team. But it seems like the Bucks underestimated Holiday's defensive value and maybe even overvalued Dame's fit in this offense, as the Bucks have gone from a top 10 defense the past couple of seasons to a bottom 10 defense that allows the most field goal attempts a game and doesn't force turnovers. And while the Bucks' offense is definitely better, Dame has been inconsistent this season, shooting 42% from the field and 35% from 3. There's a lot to be skeptical of with this Bucks team, but the worst part of this team that nobody is talking about is their bench. After the starting 5, you have Bobby Portis, who's an above-average 6-man, Jay Crowder, who's been washed up for about 6 years, Cam Payne, who's an abysmal defender, and Pat Connaughton, who is the definition of serviceable. And sure, these guys have the potential to score, but who on this list is stopping anybody on defense? This bench has hindered the Bucks time and time again, and it's pretty clear that the Bucks should make a trade soon. But if they don't, do you believe that Giannis and Dame are enough to make a run in the playoffs? Do you believe Dame will show up in the playoffs and play efficient basketball, something we've rarely seen this season? Of course you're not going to bet against this team, but you're definitely not betting on them either. I have my concerns for the playoffs, but as you know, this is a video grading their season as a whole. And after the whole Adrian Griffin and Doc Rivers fiasco and the complete regression on defense, I'm giving the Bucks a C for the season despite having a great record. Now let's talk about the Detroit Pistons, who have a chance at history to become the worst team of all time. Right now the Pistons sit at 6 wins for the season, and in order to pass the 2012 Bobcats, they can't have any more than 8 wins. So for Pistons fans, at least there's something to watch for now. But in all seriousness, there's nothing here that I can say that none of you don't already know. This team is really bad, and there's going to be a lot of change within the roster, coaching staff, and front office next season. But for you Pistons fans, let's talk about the things that may be looking up. First of all, I still believe in Cade Cunningham despite not taking that leap we all thought he would this season. There's flashes of greatness within his game, and I really think he's a piece you can still build around. Also, I'm a big fan of Jalen Duren, especially considering he's already a 14-point and 12-rebound a night talent at only 20 years old. Another young player that may have something is Jaden Ivey, who at the very least is a valuable trade piece, and at the most, a dynamic 20-point-per-game scorer as the second option to Cunningham with a lot of defensive potential. And finally, Asar Thompson and Marcus Sasser are 2 young pieces who can defend and give a lot of effort. So Thompson is certainly safe, and Sasser would only be traded if they can package him and some picks for a star. Other than these 5 guys, everyone else can go. That's how bad the situation has gotten. And hopefully the Pistons can properly start a rebuild by surrounding their young talent with players who can stretch the floor and forwards who can fit with their backcourt. As for their season as a whole, it's an obvious F. And to all the Pistons fans watching, I hope your front office can competently complete a rebuild. Next up is the Indiana Pacers, who sit at the 6th seed in the East after Tyrese Halliburton's leap to borderline superstardom. The story with this team is offense and pace, where they sit at 1st and 2nd in the NBA respectively, and that's thanks to the maestro of the offense, Halliburton, who creates open shots for his teammates and for himself at all 3 levels. Joining Halliburton is the newly acquired Pascal Siakam, who is fit like a glove with this core as someone who is dominant in the transition game, where this team thrives. And after those top 2 guys, what makes this team so solid is their depth, which is so good that the 8th overall pick Jarris Walker has barely played over 100 minutes the entire season. It's of course a great thing to have shooters like Buddy Hield and Aaron Nesmith, big men like Miles Turner, Isaiah Jackson, and Jalen Smith, overall solid pieces like Benedict Mathurin, and underrated role players like Obi Toppin, Andrew Nembhard, and TJ McConnell. But the one thing that this team is missing is those 2 guys that are straight defenders. A guy like Matisse Thybulle or Alex Caruso, whose only job on the team would be giving 100% on the defensive side of the ball. And that hole is evident on a nightly basis, as the Pacers give up the 3rd most points per game, and the reason why is because their 2-point defense is abysmal, as evidenced by the fact that they give up the most 2-point shots per game, and opponents shoot almost 56% from those shots. It's a fair assumption to say that because they go all out on offense, they're hindered on defense, and that's a problem they're going to need to fix in the future if they want to start contending. But as for right now, the Pacers are in a good spot in their rebuild, so much so that they've lost that tag in my mind and have entered the emerging contender category, where I expect them to be a top 3 or 4 seed within the next 3 seasons. For this season, I would give the Pacers an A-, because while their record may not be as great as the teams I've ranked lower, they made a great trade that will benefit them for years to come, and they've developed a potential superstar that embraces the Pacers organization. Now let's talk about the Chicago Bulls, who have been up and down this season, but let's focus on the ups first, highlighted by the 4th-year guard Coby White turning into a really solid scorer and lead ball handler. He's probably going to become that guy that averages 25 a game on a really bad Bulls team for many years to come. But I think he could maybe be the 3rd or 4th best guy on a title team, and that's saying something compared to what many thought of him before the season. Another piece that's been surprisingly good for this team is Andre Drummond, who's probably the best backup center in the league, as he's a great offensive rebounder and puts up an effective 15 minutes a night. Other than White and Drummond, the Bulls have a lot of trade pieces, like DeMar DeRozan and Alex Caruso, that could be dealt for future draft capital, and Zach LaVine will likely be off this team before the start of next season, so maybe the Bulls can get a solid young player for him. Other than that, this Bulls team is not very talented, which is largely in part to some questionable trades in the past few seasons, including the Vucevic trade that got the Magic Franz Wagner, and in part to their lack of development from lottery picks like Lauri Markkanen and Patrick Williams. Overall, I'd give this Bulls season a C-, solely because they may have found something with Coby White. But other than that, Bulls fans have this Thursday's trade deadline and the lottery to look forward to for the rest of this season. And finally, let's talk about the Cleveland Cavaliers, who are the hottest team in all of basketball, and it's happened in one of the strangest ways possible. We all had high expectations for this Cavs team, as with the amount of talent returning along with the acquisitions of Max Strus and Georges Niang, many thought the Cavs would give the Sixers and Knicks for a run for their money and finish as a top 3 seed in the East. But this team came out the gate slowly, staying around 500 before the start of December, with losses to the Pistons, Lakers, and Blazers. But ever since Darius Garland and Evan Mobley went down, somehow this team got better, and Donovan Mitchell and Jarrett Allen started to play more freely on the basketball court. Since then, the Cavs have been winning a lot, including 14 of their last 15, with some of these wins coming since the return of Garland and Mobley. And while I'm still skeptical of the Mitchell and Garland fit, and how Mobley and Allen are supposed to be a front court when they play very similar styles, it's working and the Cavs are winning. And the story with these wins is defense. I mentioned it earlier, but Jarrett Allen has improved drastically as the season has gone along and become the defensive anchor we all saw 2 years ago. His efforts, along with the efforts of their rangy wings Isaac Okoro and Max Strus, have made the Cavs a top 3 defense this season. And suddenly, the Cavs are the 2nd seed in the East, and there's no signs of them slowing down. So obviously for the season, I'm giving them an A+, but how will they perform in the playoffs after last year's disappointment? It's all dependent on how you view the Garland and Mitchell situation, but if you want my take, I don't think those two are going to be on the same team by the end of next season. Because ever since Mitchell has been on the Cavs, Garland's growth as a playmaker and ball handler has stunted. And if you're the Cavs, you're probably going to continue developing the 24-year-old who we know has all-star level talent already, compared to the 27-year-old who seems to have reached his peak, though I will say that peak is extremely high. We're going to see what happens with this core, but for now, enjoy this hot streak, Cavs fans, and know that you've got one of my only A+ grades in the NBA. So with that, we've graded all 15 Eastern Conference teams. But what do you think I missed? Comment below what you would change about my grades, and remember to subscribe for more NBA videos just like this one. I'm Julian with TalkBackSports, and I'll see you next time.